I'm David Benjamin, and today I'm going to tell you about the history of rock in America. Now, it all started back in the 1950s when a Cleveland disc jockey named Alan Freed coined the term rock and roll. Now, the first stars of rock and roll included Chuck Berry, Bill Harry, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Little Richard. Now, rock and roll at first was a hybrid of different styles of black music and white music. It appealed to the youth because of its strong backbeat, and it called people to dance. This also signified a weakening in the right's resistance to the black culture. Now let's get to the rock beat. The beat was kept by the drums, and the bass line was played by the bass guitar. The electric rhythm guitar kept the rhythm, and the lead guitar kept the intricate parts of the guitar. Some rock beats included saxophone and piano. Now, teens were very engulfed in their rock and roll, because rock and roll is about adolescence. It was about teenage problems such as school, cars, summer vacation, parents, and most importantly, love. Now let's head to the 1950s. In the 1950s, rock and roll was kind of revolved around blues. It had more of a bluegrass feel. The first national record that was heard by all people in the rock and roll was Bill Haley's Around the Clock. A certain form of rock that was popular during this time was rockabilly. It was a combination of rock, country, blues, and jazz, all combined into one theme. Now, the electric guitar became popular during this 1950s. During the 1950s, Bill Haley was the most popular album sold. Elvis reached the number 2 spot, and then one of the major events during the 1950s was on February of 1959. A plane crash killed 3 major stars, including Buddy Holly, the Big Hopper, and Ritchie Valens. Let's talk about one of the most important rock and roll characters, Elvis Presley. Now, Elvis Presley was a truck driver in Tupelo, Mississippi. He was produced by Sam Phillips, and he changed rock and roll music for all time. He really appealed to the young people, and the older people did not really like him. He appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. This made him quite famous. One of the most important instruments of this time was the electric guitar. Now, there are 3 different types of electric guitars. There are solid guitars, semi-hollow electric guitars, and hollow electric guitars. This guitar is a semi-hollow. You can see where it is cut open, and it is hollow in certain parts of the guitar, but not all parts of the guitar. Now, rock and roll had electric guitars because they wanted to hear it more, and they wanted it to be louder than just the normal acoustic guitar. Now, the first electric guitar manufactured was in 1946, when Leo Fender was the first to make a solid-body electric guitar. Later, Les Paul created the La guitar, which was just 2 pieces of wood mounted together with strings attached. In 1950, Fender created the Esquire guitar, which is now known as the Telecaster. Now, this is a Fender guitar, and it is one of the most popular guitars today. In 1951, Fender created the Precision bass, which created a bass that was like an electric guitar in that it connected to an amplifier and could be played loudly through speakers. In 1952, Gibson endorsed Les Paul to play their guitars. It was kind of advertisement for their company, and Les Pauls are still around today. In 1954, Fender created the Stratocaster. This is another very popular guitar today. And most guitars had 1 to 3 pickups, which gathered the vibrations from the strings, transferred it through a cord and into an amplifier to make it louder. Now, the sounds of the electric guitars were altered by pedals to give them more distortion or delay. Now we get to the 1960s. This is an era that was known as the British Invasion, because bands such as the Beatles came to America from Britain and transformed rock and roll here in America. There are also psychedelic bands such as Pink Floyd, The Grateful Dead, and Jimi Hendrix. They are focused around kind of drugs and going crazy. Now, heavy metal was also popular during this time. This was made famous by a popular band known as Black Sabbath. After 1964, Rock and roll, the term that has been coined by Alan Freed, was changed to just rock. This was popularized mainly by the Beatles. Companies considered rock and roll a fad before, but now as it became more popular, they searched for bands to hire and create labels with. More about the 1960s was that people started playing outdoor shows. They were not just inside in certain buildings. They played outdoor shows such as now we have Jazz Fest in New Orleans. The Beatles also in the 1960s had 7 out of the 8 most popular albums in the nation. Let's get back to the British invasion. Now, one of the most popular bands were the Beatles. They had long hair, and they were 4 lads from Liverpool, England. Rolling Stones was another band from Britain, and they derived from kind of black blues style of music. Another era during the 1960s of rock and roll was focused in Detroit. It was called Motown. This was named after Motown Records, and it was centered around black singers mainly in a certain form of rock and roll. Now we get to a certain form of rock and roll called folk rock. It was an important transformation in rock. Now, let me tell you a story. Now, an important transformation toward folk rock occurred in the Newport Music Festival in 1965. This is when Bob Dylan, who was popular for his folk music on acoustic guitar, appeared playing an electric guitar and was backed by a fully electric band featuring drums and electric bass. Now, during the 60s, an important war was going on. This was the Vietnam War. Now, the music during this time really mirrored the war. The tensions showed, and there was rebellion music featuring protest and drugs. Now, during the 1970s, people became more popular, and the music really boomed after the Vietnam War was over. Now, bands became more popular, and punk rock became a popular form of rock and roll. Punk rock featured the normal electric guitars and other rock and roll instruments, and it also included synthesizers. This was a time that the Beatles broke up, but they continued to have solo careers. Bands started playing sports arenas during this time, instead of just playing small buildings or outdoor shows. Now, during the 1970s, car stereos started playing music. They started to get music on the radio, and they had cassette players in them. Elvis dies in 1977. He was at the age of 42. After his death, people started crowding his house to tour his house and to mourn his death since he was such a popular player in music. Singer-songwriters started to appear who would write their own songs and perform them. Now let's talk about more punk rock. Punk rock songs were fast-paced songs. They had a lot of electric guitar and synthesizers, as I said before, and they contained rude lyrics. During the 70s, there was a popular time where drug abuse played a major factor in the lives of those. Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and Jimi Hendrix were 3 who all died at the age of 27. They were all dead by 1970, and they all died from some substance abuse. Now we get to the 1980s. This is when hair bands were popular. Music videos were also a popular way of promoting bands and their music. This was also in 1980, the year that John Lennon was shot by a fan after a concert. MTV was founded in 1981. This was a popular way of advertising music and showing music on television so people could watch it in their own houses. Female artists started to become more popular during this era, one of whom was Pat Benatar. Bands started playing for charity to raise money. Now we'll talk more about the hair band. These were bands such as Van Halen, Guns N' Roses, and AC/DC, who had insane hair, tight leather pants, and long, intense guitar solos. Now we get to the 1990s. This is the era of grunge and alternative rock. Grunge rock was mainly in Seattle, and it had much distortion and feedback. Pearl Jam, Nirvana, and Jane's Addiction were all forms of grunge and alternative rock. Radio airplay played a major factor during this time because bands started to advertise on air and get their music played even more on radios. Now we get to the present times during the 2000s. We still have forms of pop rock featuring like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Coldplay, and the Foo Fighters. Alternative rock is still around today, and you'll see many people walking around wearing t-shirts that advertise bands such as the Beatles, Nirvana, or Pearl Jam, or other bands. Now thank you for joining, and I hope you learned a lot about the history of rock in America. See ya!